All right, welcome everyone. I'm here to present a very interesting game from the 1972 World Championship match between Fischer and Spassky, looking at the program DecodeChess and how it explains the key ideas really well. So what we see here is it's a somewhat more complicated Roy Lopez position than what you normally get. It's not like a totally closed position, as there's obviously some tension in the center. But for the most part, this is a more strategically oriented game. I think this should be pretty clear to see. And these are the kinds of positions where I think Decode really excels compared to like your standard engines that you might just, have pre-installed on ChessBase or whatever. So here, White has a decision to make about this pawn tension. And it says, in this position, White played b takes c5. It is good because, and it explains in very human terms what the most important point is. It deflects the black pawn away from the d6 square and denies it control over e5. Consequently, b takes c5 supports playing knight takes e5. So if we were to expand upon this, we'd see that following bc5, dc5, if White were to play knight takes e5, now in the game he played d takes e5, which it just leads to the same position. Here, the move d takes e5 is impossible. Black's pawn is not allowed to move like that because it has been dragged to the c5 square. As such, after something like knight takes e5, White can play d e5, queen e5, and c4. And this is what we gave. And all of a sudden, this bishop on b2 is a very nice open piece with a lot of active prospects. While if we compare this to the position we got when we picked up the game, it's not really easy to imagine how this bishop on b2 is ever going to do anything particularly impressive or active. So when we play bc5 first, we would love to play a move like c4 to open this bishop up. But of course, if we play c4, there's going to be c takes d4. And if we play something like, if going back here where White played bc5, if we were to play d takes e5 directly, then after Black takes back, here, if White were to try taking on c5, Black has the option, two options, of taking back with a minor piece, which would leave White with a really bad position. After something like takes, Black could take with either his bishop or his knight, and this bishop on b2 is still asleep, and Black's pieces are looking really good. But by playing b takes c5 directly, it says deflects the black pawn away from d6, forcing Black to specifically take back with his pawn, which gives White a pretty reasonable position. So the game is still very complicated. So it says d takes e5 is good because it threatens to play e takes f6 or c4. Now, after d takes e5, obviously we're threatening to take the knight, and beyond some certain level of really basic beginner, we're going to expect Black not to fall for it. But we can see that after d takes e5, knight takes e5, in the game Fischer took on e5 and then played c4, but basically we're going to get c4 through, and opens up this, opens up a line for this bishop on b2 to start harassing Black's pieces. So let's see how the game actually went. The game went with d e5, knight e5, take this. And again, it says c4. This is good because it threatens to play, bishop takes e5 or c takes b5. And then we see that White's pieces are becoming active. And here, this was a very interesting decision because Fischer took on f6 unprovoked, which looks like a strange point. But it says it threatens to play c takes b5, and this just sort of comes down to tactics. Like we see here, giving up this bishop for the knight might seem like a strange decision, but following bishop f6, queen f6, c takes b5, plain and simple, we went and we grabbed the pawn. This is sort of basic tactical and calculation stuff that, as I've said, I think the marginal benefit of decode there is lower than in the more strategic kinds of positions that are harder to understand. But it's still, you can see here, that it threatens to play bishop b2 or c takes b5. So it says bishop takes f6, which basically says with the idea of bishop b2, meaning that if Black were to play b4 or something to not take the piece back, then we would just retreat with the piece up. And when Black takes back, then we're ready to grab the pawn with c takes b5. So returning to how the game went, I want to skip forward to what I thought was the most critical moment and to where both Fischer and Spassky had some case of mutual blindness. Which I thought was quite interesting how easily Decode made it look. So here at this point, Fischer sacrificed this pawn, but is looking for direct counterplay with queen f4 and trying to laser down on f7. So it says here, again, tactical stuff, I just don't think it's as useful. I mean, when the Decode does explain it well, he says Fischer played knight e5. It's good because it threatens to play bishop takes f7 check or knight takes d7. So you know, you can expand upon these. Knight e5, we're ready for bishop takes f7 check, or if black were to make some extremely stupid and cooperative move, rook b8, we can take this rook. So here it does just point out, knight e5, there's no real deep strategic purpose to it, we're just starting to attack black's pieces. So after knight e5, the game continued with, here this went rook d7, knight e5, queen c7, rook bd1, and here again it says, deflects the black rook away and denies it control over f7. This supports playing bishop takes f7 check. And it says here after rook bd1, rook takes d1, bishop takes f7 check. This wins the queen because rook takes f7 is impossible. As we can see, this rook is no longer on d7, and rook d1 takes f7 is not legal. And here black would have to give up his queen because in the event of king h8, he's going to get mated by knight g6 and queen h4. That sort of explains why rook bd1 works. And again, it's not really, tactically, it's not really this places where I would think this is going to be the most useful compared to another engine. But even here, it still does a very good job of explaining why rook bd1 threatens to play rook takes d7 and deflects the black rook away from d7 to deny it control over f7. Of course, after rook bd1, Spassky didn't just fall apart. He fought back pretty well. And so now, after bishop takes f7 check, things get very forced. And here we see that in the event of this position, black now played bishop takes e4 because this bishop is going to be lost anyway. In the event of king takes f7, there will be rook d7 check. So bishop e4 comes, rook e4, king f7, and then check, rook b7, b4 came, or bishop d6 check was probably not great, but here b4 came, and this is the next key position. So this is a very interesting endgame because what we see is white has an extra exchange for a pawn. Now black has these two connected passers on the queen side, but for the moment they're pretty well blockaded. Still, there's only one way for white to guarantee a winning position here, and Fischer didn't find it. So it says the best move is g4. And this is good because it prevents king f5 and prevents threatening king takes f5, king f6 to f5 to e4. Understanding why king f5 is so important can be seen if we click on the little plus here, where it says in the event of g4, bishop e5. This is what black really wants to play. If black can anchor his bishop on d4, he will be able to harass the f2 pawn with rook a2. He will have this constellation where c5, bishop d4, and b4 are all like perfectly placed, defending each other, no weaknesses to be had. These pawns are dangerous both in the short and long run. The bishop is nice and active, and when this bishop is anchored on d4, black should be totally fine. And here we see that after rook b6 check, black cannot play king f5. Without 39 g4, black could have played king f5, and then he would have been okay. So g4 eliminates the threat of bishop e5. This is like putting into human words some very deep concepts that normally like a computer will just play these moves and leave it to you to figure out why they're so brilliant. But g4 would have won the game here. And this would have been much better than what Fischer did. In the game after h5, Fischer started with rook b6, and here it says king f5 was the best move. It says white has a small advantage. Black should be aware of white playing rook takes d6 check. Sure, that's not rocket science, but king f5 is the best move. It threatens to play king takes e4, so as we can see here, in the event of g4 check, it's too late for this. We can take the rook, and you can't play rook takes d6 either because king takes e4 takes the rook. So we're ready to break this pin and then get the bishop to e5 properly. And after king f5, I believe black would have been fine. Instead, there was this case of mutual blindness. Spassky played rook d1. And again, here at this point, the best move was once more g4 to stop black's king from getting to f5 to fix his coordination. Following king f3, here black would have been able to put up quite a bit more resistance if he had played a bit better. For example, what the computer is recommending now is rook d3 check, kicking the king away, rook d5, and it's, as you can see here in this line, when we get this rook to d5, black's king is now safe to come to a square like g5. So for example here, and when we see that after king e3, rook d1, it's now a little bit too late for white to play g4 because black can safely get his king to g5, which means his bishop will reach somewhere reasonably intelligent. And I think black still has some work to do to save this game, but it's definitely going in the right direction compared to what it could have been if white had played g4 instead of king f3. which would have done the job. So yeah, moving on, I think that the rest of the game wasn't wildly interesting. Hang on, this is not right. There's some annotations here that were just copied from ChessBase that I probably should have deleted, but yeah. So here, this King F3 move would have been, this G4 move would have done the job. So here instead, King E2 is played, and after F4, G6, Black just took up a more passive defensive setup here, just trying to get some kind of a fortress, but this is not going to hold up very easily, as now his king is going to come under fire. Following HG, it says Black played G5, it's good, but it also is saying 2.81. That means as soon as it says that a good move still leads to a dead loss position, at that point you're just lost, so you don't want to go too much further than that. But I thought Decode did a very good job here of showing a few critical moments. First, why it was important to play b takes c5 early on to help wake up the b2 bishop. Second, it really explained in very human terms what the tactical orientation was, what was going on tactically in that spot where White was playing knight e5 and rook bd1, where he was trying to distract the rook on d7 from the f7 pawn. And then finally it showed this key theme in the endgame where White really needed to play g4 to stop Black from playing king f5, and that Black actually missed this option. So again, it's suggesting all the same moves as any standard engine that you might see, but I just think it explains them in a way that makes a lot more sense to a human, and I think this game is a good example of that. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again for another DecodeChess video sometime.